because we have Wendy Douglas with us. I don't think I've interviewed you before, but you were at the retreat. You've been connected with Call to Peace Ministries. And so I'm really excited that you're here today. And we're going to be talking about grief, which I know is like, why are you excited about that? But y'all, the way she shares this is just so hopeful, peaceful, and just amazing. She helped us go through a hard time when we had suffered a loss, and I just was really impacted by her teaching, and I'm really excited for you to hear from her. So Wendy, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me today. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you and everyone who's joining us today. So, I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate. That's a whole mouthful of words. That just means that I'm a counselor in North Carolina. And I'm also a certified grief educator, and I've done some work with the late Dr. H. Norman Wright, if anyone has been a part of that Grief Share program. And so I really specialize in grief, loss, and trauma because I think it is such an important piece of our life journey, and grief impacts us all throughout our life. And so I really enjoy helping people through that journey because it truly is a process that helps us to heal our pain.
Yes. Oh, well, I'm excited to get into today's conversation and hear more about this and what you have to share on this. So let's get started. And we also have some questions from some of our listeners too. So I put up a post on Facebook, and I think Instagram put stories in there as well, and got people to ask questions about things they wanted to know about grief. And so I've got a couple of questions I want to ask towards the end, and I might weave them in the middle here if they make sense. So I'll let you know when I'm dropping in a question, just so people who are listening know where to find their question. Okay, so let's get started. And that is, let's start with understanding grief. And what is grief and how does it show up in our lives?
Well, if we start with the definition of grief, grief is a normal response to any loss. And anytime you lose something that you didn't want to lose, you experience grief. And grief means that it mattered to you. And it's a way that you honor what that loss is, right? Because you had an attachment to someone or something, and it can take months, and sometimes it can take years of just this gradual relinquishing of that attachment, so that in time, with lots of grief work, with grace and truth, it becomes this memory from the past. So you remember it, but it doesn't really have the same power that it once did. And then, for those of us who have faced abuse and trauma, we can experience what is known as existential shattering. And so our assumptive world, the way we assume that the world worked, how God works, we have to re-examine that. And, so we have to ask those questions all over again and examine those beliefs. And, I found there was a research study done at Arizona State University, and they found that grief was the most suppressed emotion of those leaving abusive relationships. And so I just want to state up front that abuse is never deserved by anyone, and it's never the survivor's fault, because the person doing the harm is the one that's always responsible for the harm that's caused. And I know that anytime that there's abuse, that there is a cause for grief because you've lost something, and you probably lost something that mattered to you. But each time a woman reaches out for help, it is a sign of resilience, strength, and courage, and it is a step toward rebuilding. And you can do these things while experiencing grief, and grief actually helps you to do that rebuilding.
Oh, I like that. Seeing grief is something that helps us versus something to be like, oh, I hate that. It's actually kind of
Mm-hmm.
like something that's propelling us towards healing. So
Yeah.
can you tie in a little bit of your own story too to this and tell me how that shapes the work that you do today now that we've kind of defined grief?
Sure. So I actually was born into a home of domestic violence, with my first memory being that of watching an abuse experience. And what we know is that trauma is not really the event itself, but it's what happens on the inside of us as a result of that event. And so I have learned, and research supports this, that children need one healthy adult. And for me, my grandparents were those healthy adults. They were my secure attachment. And thankfully, I lived really close to them. I spent time with them every weekend. But at age 15, my grandmother died. And at age 16, my grandfather died. And unfortunately, it just wasn't safe enough for me to process my losses at that time. And so I didn't get to process them until much later. And I had a lot of adverse childhood experiences growing up. And I don't say that as a badge of honor. I say that to give hope to people listening, because we are not the sum of our experiences. If we were, I would not be sitting here today. And it's easy to think, right, that life can get ruined by certain experiences, but I am living proof that God builds beauty from ashes, because I had no reason to choose God, but He chose me and He gave me the faith to follow Him. So, Lauren, I know grief not only professionally, but I do know it personally too.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that very personal story. And you mentioned childhood trauma. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. How do you, how would you, excuse me, how have you learned that childhood trauma affects the way we grieve as adults?
So when we experience loss, it's kind of like our brain has this loss file that it opens up, and it either opens to completed losses or unprocessed losses, because new losses tap into those old losses. And when it opens up to completed losses, then we can focus on the loss that we are experiencing in the present. But if that loss file opens up to unprocessed losses, that new loss is going to tap into the old loss, and our response can be over the top. And you can ask me how I might know that. But whether or not we have grieved those previous losses will affect the way that we grieve. And another thing that can affect the way that we grieve is our attachment style.
Hmm.
We either have an avoidant, an anxious, a disorganized, or a secure attachment, because we either learn that the world was safe and people are approachable, or we learn that the world isn't safe and that people are scary. And grief is designed to be done in community. And so if we have an insecure attachment, we may not feel comfortable to invite other people into our story. But the Bible tells us to mourn with those who mourn. And so if you're not comfortable being in community, it does affect your grief. But the good news is that our attachment styles can change, they're not fixed.
Wow, that's all of that was just so profound and leaves me with so many questions and things along those lines too. Yeah, wow, that was amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And if y'all are listening and y'all have any more questions, you feel free to drop those in here. And I have a question from a listener. It's just on my heart, and I feel like maybe I should go ahead and ask this one.
Sure.
It said, okay, yeah, it's such a great topic. Here's some things I struggle with. Why am I so afraid to grieve? Why don't I feel grief at all? And how should I overcome the numbness to start grieving?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot in that, for sure. But sometimes we don't feel safe enough to grieve, like I mentioned. And
Hmm.
when we enter the grief process, we really do enter a time of being vulnerable. And so we want to feel safe and protected when we enter into a vulnerable state. And sometimes that means that you have to limit your time around certain people who might be critical or dismissive of your experience. But there's actually a great quote by doctors Cloud and Townsend. And let me just grab that here, because I just want to read that, because I think that this is really good. And they said, grief is a letting down and letting go. And we cannot let down and let go if we're not being held up. If there's not enough love to sustain us both inside and out, then we cannot let go of anything, even something bad. So if you think about in times of famine, you don't throw out moldy bread, right? But if a bread truck arrives, right, you can make room for fresh bread. And so we need people who can hold us up emotionally when we grieve. And, if we don't have that support, we just won't be able to grieve fully. But we also need structure. Right, we need help because we're hardwired for connection with safe people. We don't thrive when we're isolated, and healing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in community. And so getting into a support group, right? Grief doesn't need a lot of time, but it does need dedicated time. And groups can provide a time and a space for grieving and processing. So, and then the other part of that question, she talked about numbness. And so if you're feeling numb, it tells me that your nervous system is probably in a shutdown state. And for some reason, your body just doesn't feel safe enough to begin that grief process yet. And so it's really hard to say what the next steps are without knowing the circumstances. But, finding a coach or a therapist or supportive community like Called to Peace can really be helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for saying that about groups. This month, we'll be talking about support groups, and those are free to women who are walking through domestic abuse. And we offer them their 16 lessons that we go through, and it helps women process grief. And that's so important. I'm really glad that you mentioned it happens in community. And I remembered my thought that just froze on me for a moment right before I asked this question. And I guess I'm supposed to ask this question first, and this comes back. I love how the Holy Spirit works. But I had thought about that when you were saying that if we haven't grieved previous traumas and then also new trauma happens, those grief affects us. I think that can explain a lot of things for a lot of women going through domestic abuse right there in that statement, because a lot of times women who end up in domestic abuse, not always, come from abusive backgrounds. Maybe they were in an abusive ministry or abusive home or whatever that was. So they don't really understand that they were in abuse. And then finally they do, and they come out, and it's so much grief all at once. You're not just grieving your marriage, you're grieving sometimes a lifetime of abuse and several other things. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that too, just because that's kind of on my mind. And I think that can make coming out of abuse feel much more overwhelming because of the amount of grief that you're grieving from previous traumas.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that's why it's so important, if you can, to be able to grieve those losses as they happen. But I know that that's just not always the case, right? Just like for me, I couldn't grieve the loss of my grandparents when my body did not feel safe enough to do that. And that's the thing about grief. Grief is patient. It will wait for you. It will wait for years. And when you can get into relationship with other safe people, where you feel seen, where you feel known, where you feel heard, where you don't feel judged, that can really help you to be able to do that letting go and that let down process, like doctors Cloud and Townsend were speaking of.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you for sharing that again and helping validate that. And yes, it's so important to be in safe relationships. We don't heal in isolation. We talk about that over and over again in Call to Peace. That's why retreats,
Mm-hmm.
everything we do, and the advocacy course, we try to put women together and help build community. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I kind of want to ask this question too before we move on to our next subject, which is grief and forgiveness. So y'all hold on, because this is it's going to get really deep, and you're going to love it. So the next question is, how do you explain the difference between healing and just getting over it? Because that is a common word that's used a lot, I feel like, in our culture. Just get over it, move on. It's been too long. Why are you still grieving? That type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. There is so much in grief, and our society as a whole is pretty grief illiterate. And when people want you to get over it, it's usually about their discomfort, right, with your grief. And so, the truth is, right, we have to go through our own process, right? Grief is as unique as your fingerprint. You don't have the same process that someone else has. And so being able to embrace your journey, because we all bring in different contextual factors, right? Even grief within a family is going to be different because, you know, I might have a different relationship with my father than my siblings or than with my other parent, right? We all have our own relationships and we all have our own experiences that affect that grief process. And so I don't think that we ever just get over it. I just don't think that that's really possible, just to get over it, because what happens is we have to really feel it and we have to understand what has happened and what we have lost and be able to grieve those losses that have happened as a result.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like you're just validating so much everything for me. It's like, oh, I just want to scream. Like, I feel like my inner child. Well, I guess we don't say that, but you know what I mean? The person that's experienced those wounds is finally saying, thank you for seeing me in that. And I'm sure that other people are feeling that too who are watching that. And I think that's so important to say we don't really get over it. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way about your childhood and everything else. I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like there's things that I've experienced in this life that you never really get over. You just can't. But the grief lessens. But we'll talk more about that too, because I think that's important to say and talk more about. But let's jump into layered grief and forgiveness before we kind of get further into the grief process and walking that out. Is that good with you?
Yeah.
All right. So as we focus on grief and forgiveness, I have a few questions here. And the first one is, many survivors are told just forgive. Why is that so harmful without grieving first?
Oh, well, first of all, I just want to say I am so sorry if that has been your experience. And I do hear that a lot. But you can't forgive until you understand the impact of what happened to you, right? When we have a primary loss, we also have secondary losses. So if you've lost your marriage, you may have also lost your home, you may have lost finances, you may have lost friends, you may have lost family, you may have even lost your church family. And so we have to really understand and grieve each of those losses. And many times, we don't get acknowledgement of the harm that was done to us. And so just forgive doesn't acknowledge that harm. And grief from abusive relationships usually goes unrecognized and unacknowledged, which makes it something called disenfranchised grief. And so to begin to grieve, you have to embrace the whole of what you lost, the good, the bad, the ugly. And how we view ourselves in our grief makes a huge difference, because there was actually this study down in 2014 that found that self-blame and not regret was the most powerful determinant of grief outcomes, outside of depression. And so it's really important to examine the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And if you don't take time to reflect on your whole story, so just forgive doesn't allow time for reflection, right? You will miss some important pieces that will help you to move forward, and you can end up stuffing your grief in the name of just forgive, and that's not helpful.
Thank you. Thank you again. Everything you're sharing, I'm like, thank you. Thank you for sharing this. That's
Yeah.
so good. I appreciate that so much. And thank you for sharing that. And I want to jump into another subject that's connected with grief and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's anger. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about that. This is going to be
Mm-hmm.
what's
Yeah.
the connection between
Yeah.
anger and healing? Can anger
Mm-hmm.
actually be healthy?
Yes. So again, we have to understand the impact of what happened to us, right? It's normal to get angry when something has happened to us unjustly, right? If somebody just comes up to you and shoves you, right? Of course, it's like, wait, what? And then they try to blame you for them shoving you, right? Of course, we're going to get angry when we're treated unjustly. That's normal, but it's really important to understand that anger isn't bad. It's an emotion, right? What we do with that anger can be unhealthy, and we might need some help with that, but anger itself can be healthy. And the reason why is because anger tells us that we've got a problem to solve. And many times it tells us that our boundaries have been crossed. And anger is what gives us energy to solve our problem. But you got to get really clear and understand what your problem is. Because many times we try to make someone else's problem, right? Their drinking, their attitude, their this, their that. We try to make that our problem, but that's not our problem. And so getting clarity on what your problem is to solve will be really helpful. And, God says that He has given us the spirit of power, love, and of a sound mind. And to act within your power, you have to understand what are those things that you can control and what are the things you can't control, because we can't control other people. And so, yes, anger can be healthy in that it helps us to solve problems.
Thank you again. Once again, I will keep just saying thank you. That's so good that you're addressing that, because that is often a misconstrued concept in our church or teachings, like you can't be angry, or what that looks like. At least for me in my background growing up, very, very conservative. And I mean
Mhm.
conservative isn't more legalistic, but like anger was considered, you should never feel that. That means that you're selfish.
Mhm.
But it's
Mhm.
a God-given emotion, and we're to pay
Yes.
attention and listen to it and use it to propel us to heal and to, I like what you say, take accountability for what we can control and what we can
Mhm.
do, and let go of what we can't do. We can't bring forth justice. We can to a certain extent. We can try. I've,
Mhm.
in my own situation and things that I've done, we can expose those who are evil or bring them to court and things like that. But
Mhm.
ultimately, you can't bring forth always the justice that you want. That is God's. The justice and the vengeance belongs to Him. But we take
Mhm.
our actions and find peace in that. So I love how you share that. That was just so validating and healing, and I hope other people are finding that as well.
Mhm.
So, okay, well, let's jump into layered healing, and then I'll be
Mhm.
asking my second question that I had submitted from Instagram right after this question. So, if you submitted a question, hold on, because it's going to come out. So layered healing. You mentioned healing is like peeling an onion when we had a conversation before this, and so I
Mhm.
want to get more into that. Can you talk about what it means to work within your window of tolerance as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me first just kind of explain what the nervous system is.
Yes.
So, our nervous system is actually comprised of our central nervous system, which includes your brain and your spinal cord. And then we also have our autonomic nervous system, which controls your body's automatic processes. And that's the sensing and the feeling part that responds without your conscious awareness. So, if there were a loud noise behind me, I would just turn around without thinking about it. And so your autonomic nervous system doesn't always respond to the brain's commands. So you can't always just say, get over it or calm down, right? Because your body, your autonomic nervous system is sensing things in your environment and it's reacting to it. And that's a good thing because thinking time can take away from survival time, right? If you were in the wilderness and this orange and black thing, you notice coming into the perimeter, if you stop to think, wonder what that is. Is that a cat? Kind of looks like it. Maybe I should, your chances of survival are getting slimmer the longer you think about it. And so God has designed our body in a way that to keep us safe, right? To help us survive. And so we are hardwired toward growth and toward life. And our autonomic nervous system is made up of three different pathways, right? You've got your resilient zone, you've got your fight, flight, freeze zone, and you've got your shutdown and collapse zone. And whichever path has the most energy is going to be the path that kind of shapes your experience, kind of like the lens that you view the world through. We can't always see it clearly when we are in one of our threat states. But when you're in your window of tolerance, that's your resilient zone, where life's not necessarily perfect, but you feel like you can handle whatever comes your way. However, we are not meant to stay in our resilient zone all the time. No one does, right? Because let's be honest, life is stressful, and we were made to be able to handle stressful things. But we were made to go into these different threat states to help us as a part of survival. But then we come back into that resilient zone. But sometimes what happens, even when we get back into a place where we're externally safe, we feel internally unsafe and we can stay in those threat zones. And that ends up becoming chronic stress, which ends up producing physical symptoms in our body. So the goal is not to be in your resilient zone all the time. The goal is to have a flexible nervous system where you can go into that fight, flight, freeze state and then be able to come back into that resilient zone.
Wow, that's amazing how the body works. I feel like
It
that's
is.
such a gift from God that our body works in that
Mm-hmm.
capacity to be able to keep us safe and everything. So I just want to take a moment to say that. So,
Yeah.
um, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to add to that before I ask my question here?
Not at this time.
Okay, sorry.
I might think of something.
Okay. Well, I have a question from a listener, and I'm kind of going to hear it kind of leads into our next question, too. And that is I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on grief growing deeper over time. I feel as I mature in Christ, I understand why he was a man of sorrows. The more you know, the deeper you can grieve.
Yeah. It's true. You can't grieve deeper than what you've exposed yourself to. Because as you do your own grief work, you have more space to understand grief and that other people have a story too. And sometimes it's a story that you don't know anything about. And I find that people who do really good grief work and deep grief work is that you grow in compassion and love for your fellow man, right? You can understand that hurt people really do hurt people. And while you can have compassion for it, you don't excuse somebody's behavior, right? And you can hold space for the fact that there really are wicked people that you have to protect yourself from. And that is a grief all in itself.
That was a really good answer. Thank you so much. And so I kind of want to jump into our next question and that is, how should someone respond when new waves of grief or memory resurface years later?
Mm. Yeah, that's actually can be common. And what you're referring to, Lauren, is called delayed grief. And like I said earlier, grief is patient. It will wait for you no matter how many years go by. But
Mhm.
usually, when new waves of grief emerge, it's that next layer of loss that's asking for healing. And so we have to accept it and create space to honor it so that you can do that grief work. And remember, grief work is the process of naming and feeling our feelings, inviting safe, supportive people into our story so that eventually we can come to a place of peaceful acceptance of what's been lost in our life.
Yes, and I see a comment here I'm just responding to, which I thought was really good, and I wanted to bring up really quickly. And she says, struggling to get my body back to wholeness, cortisol, thyroid, and body weight. And I just want to say that that is very common among survivors to struggle because what impacts us, I love what you're sharing today, Wendy, because it's so important. What impacts us emotionally and our nervous system also impacts our body and our health and how we feel and everything. So it's so important to find wholeness and healing internally and to grieve and to not shut these things out because they do lead to health issues. But you can help reverse those through holistic medicine as well as through grieving and letting those things out helps restore your body back to its
Yeah.
normal function in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Because right when we enter those threat states where we're stressed, that cortisol and adrenaline are helpful to us in those states, right? Because if that tiger was approaching us, right, we want the adrenaline and cortisol to be, our blood flow to be diverted to our arms and our legs so we can get out of there, right? That's a good thing. But, when it stays in our system, it affects all kinds of bodily processes. But we can change some of those things. One is getting to a place where you feel safe. One is getting in community with other supportive people where you feel seen and known and, again, not judged. And then doing some body work, right? There's some deep breathing exercises that we can do to help us. We can also journal, right? There's lots of practical things that we can do when we feel overwhelmed by grief. And so, if that overwhelm is not getting better, I would really encourage people to reach out to a coach or a therapist, because really what you want to do is look at the trend of your grief. Is it getting a little bit better, right? Because I think sometimes the expectation is grief does like this, it's the straight line up, but it's more like that stock market line, right? Where we have an upward trend, but we can have some really big ups and some really big falls. And then we can have some little ones, little ups and downs along the way. So really looking at the trend is going to be important. A second thing is that it's going to be important to put words to what you're thinking and feeling. There's something called name it to tame it, and that just helps the brain to calm. And you can do that through writing things down, through journaling, through painting, through finding music that expresses what you're feeling, or through reflection as you're doing like walking or hiking. But the most important thing is going to be to feel your feelings, whatever they are, because our feelings helps us to move through them. And I know a lot of people will say, I feel like if I start crying, I'm not going to stop. Well, first, I've never met anybody that hasn't stopped crying. I know people have been through long periods where they stop and start a lot. But crying actually releases some feel good hormones. It releases oxytocin, which improves our mood and helps us to release pain. It releases endorphins, which helps us to release stress in our body. And so that's why after you've had a really good cry, a lot of times you feel a little bit lighter and you feel a little bit better. And then there was actually some research where they looked at tears underneath a microscope, and they found that sad tears are actually shaped different from happy tears. And so you literally are releasing what your body doesn't need when you cry. And then, one of the last pieces is there's really no quick or easy solution to grief or domestic abuse. And so it's a time that we have to exercise faith. And faith is going to be an important component here too, because faith reminds us that we're not forsaken in the darkest of times, even when it does feel that way, right? And one way to exercise faith, and I think this is really helpful, is by allowing God's word to give a voice to our pain through the process of lament. And if someone is not familiar with lament, it's just that passionate expression of sorrow that's poured out to God in prayer. So when you think about the Psalms, right, you can even Google Psalms of lament, and those will come up, because lament is what keeps your soul oriented toward God and away from the pit of despair. And it really has this raw quality to it. It's not bright siding, so it doesn't try to make the pain less than what it is. And it never begins a sentence with, well, at least, right? How many of you have heard that, right? Well, at least this or at least that. But lament actually acknowledges the struggle to trust and the confusion that we feel when life doesn't make sense to us. And so it allows us to hold unimaginable sorrow and deep joy simultaneously. And, a lot of times people will say, you're still talking about that? You're not over that yet? Well, lament doesn't rush us through the process. As believers, lament is how we make sense of the pain and the confusion and the bewilderment that we feel, so that when we do hit rock bottom, we find that there's solid ground. And if anybody wants to learn more about lament, there's a great book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy.
Oh, I'm gonna write that in. Dark clouds. Oh, misspelling clouds there. I'm gonna put that in there just because I know people will be asking what it was that you said. So I kind of want to jump in a little bit here into two questions. First is I heard you mention about grounding, taking a walk in the woods and things like that. Is there any other practical things that you recommend people to do that help them when they feel overwhelmed by grief?
One thing is emotion needs motion. And so get moving. A lot of times, though, in grief, we want to do slow movements. Whether that is swaying, humming, singing, that actually stimulates our vagus nerve. And it stimulates in a way that activates what's called our parasympathetic nervous system, and that's that calming system of the body. Boy, God knew exactly what he was talking about when he called us to worship, didn't he? And so I really love humming and singing as practical ways as well. And then also, don't dismiss getting together with someone to have coffee, right? Having face-to-face communication with another supportive person is one of the most humanizing things that we do.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And then you talked a little bit about lamenting. And I was just wondering what other encouragement you would offer somebody who feels like they're falling apart and not healing fast enough. I would like to relate this back to our walking with the Lord and how that's helped you as well.
Yeah. So, for that person that feels like they're falling apart and that they're not healing fast enough, oh, my heart would just say, dear one, that is a judgment in disguise about your grief. And it's very normal, because who wants pain to go slow? Not me. Right. But it's a judgment that the grief is not on time, which is the most natural thing in the world. And, it might seem counterintuitive, but to speed it up, you actually have to be willing to let it be whatever it is, at whatever speed it is. And so you have to accept where you are to be able to move forward. And to grieve, you have to allow your feelings to be what they are without judging them, because we tend to have feelings about our feelings, right? I'm angry, and then I think, "Oh, I shouldn't be angry. I should be grateful." And, we just have feelings upon feelings upon feelings, and they end up being judgments of those feelings. And so instead of judging them, what if we could accept the compassion that God has already given us as we feel them and work through them and invite safe people into our story?
Thank you for sharing that. I needed to hear that today. That was really
Yeah.
beautiful. Um, yeah, I have a question too, kind of as we wrap up here, a couple things to leave people really encouraged. And I really like this question is how can someone tell if they're making progress, even if it still hurts?
Mm. Again, look at that trend, right? Is it an upward trend? Or is it a bad day? Because sometimes we feel like we're back at square one and that we haven't made any progress when we just had a really bad day where we remember what happened, and those feelings were really intense. And so as you do your grief work, it gets a little easier with the ingredients of grace and truth over time. And then ask yourself, are you allowing your grief to be witnessed? Because we know that having grief witnessed by another is an important part of the healing process. God didn't put our tear ducts in our eyes for no reason, right? It would be so great if we could control grief, but we can't, right? I know that I like to think that I want to tell grief when I'm done with it, but grief kind of tells us when it's done with us,
Yeah.
because grief is not predictable, right? It doesn't fit in a box, even though I want it to fit nicely in that bento box with a pretty bow on top and throw it in the junk closet. But it doesn't tell you in advance when it's going to come, how long it's going to stay, what might activate it, or how great or small it may be at any given time. Sometimes grief is 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, which is perfectly normal. And what we tend to focus on are those 2 steps back, and we forget, oh, I am a step ahead.
Thank you. And I also just feel I want to ask this question too as we close out here. And that is what else? I know we talked a little bit about lamenting. What else would you add, or is there anything else you want to say about grief in the Bible or somebody's relationship with God and how that impacts grief? Just kind of closing us out with something to leave our thoughts on God with grief.
Absolutely. So Ecclesiastes actually talks about the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. And grief causes us to reflect on life in general, but also it causes us to reflect on our life specifically. And grief is a process that has to be engaged, right? It's not a problem to be solved, right? That's how we think of it. I got to solve this problem, but we have to engage the process, and it's engaged voluntarily. And so, I think when Solomon pointed out, right, that the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. He wanted us to be aware that our tendency is to avoid pain. I mean, who likes pain? Not me. And so we can look to things to dull our pain, but they don't help us to solve our problem. And so it's really only as we acknowledge our loss and express and name our feelings and invite safe people into our story that we can resolve that pain. Because unresolved pain gets remembered in the brain and the body until it's completed. And so you can push pause on your grief journey if you want to, but it will continue to affect you until you begin to do that work. But God promises us that regardless of wherever we are on that grief journey, that He is right there with us, and that He will never leave us, and He will never forsake us.
I'm taking a deep breath to breathe that in, and I hope you do as well, and just absorb what she just said. And that was so beautiful. And I know there's people watching today, they're like, I wish I could connect with Wendy. How could somebody connect with you if they want to talk to you further, maybe schedule an appointment with you? Because you take clients in North Carolina only, correct?
I do. Yes. Yes. So I actually have a website, breatheagaincounseling.com. And for those who live outside of North Carolina, I have a website called Delighted by Grace that has lots of just resources that you can access. And so that's delightedbygrace.com.
Okay, I've dropped them both in here. So that way anybody who's watching this wants to get in touch with you or get a hold of some more resources and things like that. Wendy, this was such an excellent conversation today. I mean, I'm going to go back and re-listen to this myself and just soak it all in. It was so beautiful and so needed. You just gave a voice to so many of our listeners of helping us understand grief and helping us not feel ashamed in it. And I think that's a huge part of moving forward in it. So thank you so much for your time today and for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you're here for the first time. Definitely having you back. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was an honor to be here.
All right. Well, everybody, I hope you all have a great day. And I hope you feel seen by God today and loved by Him. So thank you.